the co-writer, co-directors of Warfare, Ray Mendoza and Alex Garland, and star Will Poulter. Thank you. So, in starting to talk about this film, first, Ray, of course, to turn to you, this is the culmination of many years of working on sets as a military consultant, including on Civil War with Alex. But I have read that you started to think about this story while you were on active duty, how you would tell it. Why was this a story that you had to tell, and what were the challenges in pushing it forward?
Yeah, so obviously the reason is why I had to tell it is because Elliot doesn't remember, which I spoke about before. And over the years, Elliot would send emails, and I think in literary form, it was hard for him to construct it. And oftentimes in the Navy, when we do our reports, it's very like linear. They'll just take my perspective and the other person's perspective. They don't put much effort into slotting all of our memories together. So for Elliot, who does not recall the incident, we were all there. I know what color it was, what it smelled like, what it looked like, the temperature, but he does not recall that. So there's a bit of frustration for him. And it was hard watching him be frustrated with that kind of void in your memory. So yeah, that was kind of the driver behind it. The difficulties, being that it's a very traumatic event for me, Elliot being my friend, you know, often in combat, when you're seeing kind of the worst of humanity, but you also see the best of humanity, but you see a lot of bad things. And so to function, some of us, I would say most of us, that are in combat and serve, you have to compartmentalize that stuff. And you push it down, because you can't really function if you're trying to think about that. And by function, I mean you're having to make decisions that require a lot of factors and variables. That's kind of what I call like adaptation at speed. So then another incident happens and we create another compartment, and before you know it, it's just this iron core that you're harnessing all these memories in. So for me to go down this path, I was gonna crack that open. And I had to really ask myself if I was ready to go down that, which requires therapy, emotionally being ready, having the support system for me there. And one of that first steps is reaching out and talking to all my friends that were there and seeing how they felt about it. Because I was gonna need their support. I was gonna need a lot of people's support for that. And then the next phase of that was the trust with Alex, which we'll get into later. But building that trust kind of started to scratch the surface of that on Civil War. So, yeah, those were like the initial challenges for me.
Thank you. To ask then a little bit more about the breakdown of responsibilities on set, co-writers and co-directors between you and Alex, could you talk a little bit about that specifically as well in terms of working with the actors and how that process kind of was refined and worked on set?
Yeah, that's a two-part process, but if Alex, if you wouldn't mind speaking to your specialty, or everything is your specialty, but in regards to this, yeah, your responsibility, and then I'll kind of add on to the cast.
It's a little bit difficult to kind of divide everything up because not just with directors, but with everybody, actors and crew members. At least working on the films that I've worked on in my life, I understand that auteur theory exists, I understand its principles, I get all of that, but it's not my working life, it's not my experience of filmmaking. My filmmaking experience is that it's a conversation, it's a dialogue where you are sort of learning from each other and calling on each other's skill sets and moving towards a kind of agreed end goal. And in that respect, this was like other films. But there was one super clear delineation in my mind when it came to the process. One was in terms of the writing. I don't know if people in the room are familiar with the dogma film movement, but there was a kind of dogma-like principle to this film, which is that I was not allowed to invent anything. Nobody was allowed to give a note. Nothing could appear in the script or in the film that wasn't sourced exclusively from someone that was there. And it was a very, very simple rule. What it meant was that as a writer, a lot of my job was listening. It was just listening to Ray, and then interviewing other people that were involved in this incident, and then collating it into the structure of the, we call a screenplay. But it was not like writing in a sort of traditional sense from my point of view. So that was one clear delineation, is I wasn't inventing anything. I was just trying to learn as much as possible from Ray. The second thing was when it came to actors. Will attest, I was a useless director because there was nothing I could contribute to an actor. If an actor had a question, what would be the point of asking me? Ray was there, I wasn't there. And I was concerned with other areas, I would say. So when it came to, in a way, the transmission of the emotion that you see on the screen, which is really through performance, and I was quite recused from that. I had nothing to contribute, so I observed and then did my best to record, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I'll brag for Alex. So I think I think actually the question went to, if I had to give an answer of how this was split up, I think, and it was really out of necessity for speed and making our days and just really being efficient and rolling with it. But it was he's his technical expert with the lenses, which I learned a lot from early on. It was just like, hey, how are we going to capture this moment? There's not a lot of dialogue, as you notice, at least narrative to explain what the relationships were, which we did through like looks and like just subtext. And so he helped tremendously with that. And for me, I was essentially had to track like everyone's arcs. There's a lot of people in there. These are all my friends, and so it was super important for me to represent what they did, because that's a special moment. And I only have one chance to do this, and I wanted to make sure that how they felt, the actions that they did were represented. And so yeah, that was essentially just me trying to track all those guys to make sure they started at a certain point and ended at a certain point. So it's simple answer.
Thank you. And Will, from your perspective as well, I mean, you're an absolute force in this film, and it's wonderful to see you on screen in this way. It's so clear that you and the actors had this deep brotherhood that you had developed, I understand, over the course of a 3-week boot camp. And that was, there are many things that you learned over that boot camp, and I know that you even had nicknames and call signs that you made for each other. What did they call you?
Starting off with the easy ones. They call me Daddy, which yeah.
Can you tell us why?
I think that was more because I was bugging guys about whether they'd taken lunch yet and whether they knew what day laundry was, and very kind of like basic things like that. I think more than anything else, yeah.
There was also a command structure that was in place on the film that reflected the way that the Navy SEALs operate as well. Could perhaps, can you talk a little bit about that command structure and what that brought to your relationship as actor-director?
I'll start off, and you can go into depth on it if you don't mind. So right off the bat, there's 2 leadership roles, 3. So it'd be Will, Charles Mountain, and Joseph Quinn. And essentially the hierarchy I created is I don't want anyone coming up to me asking questions on time, what they needed, where we're going to be, what time's lunch. I don't want to hear any of that shit. That's you guys. If there's a problem, let me know, and we'll figure it out. But I essentially gave them the reins. You run it how you want to run it, but it's on you. If you're late, I'm going to fucking come to you and I'm going to be really fucking pissed. So, they took on this responsibility. And that was a part of the process. I wanted for them to experience the burden of leadership, especially a bunch of young men with fucking testosterone going through the roof. And so fucking good luck with that. I've been there. And so that was just a part of it, having to manage, not only what he needed to do as to portray Eric in the film, but I wanted it over, I don't know how overwhelming it was, but just the amount of time that we had, I just wanted to expose as much of that, the culture of it. No, not just the character, but like the culture of that and having to make leadership decisions. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, so much of what you see is sort of non-traditional, breaks with convention in terms of how stories are told and how films are made, and so that called for a kind of unconventional pre-production and a very different sort of preparation style for all of us as actors. And I think we had a huge amount of respect and reverence for both Alex and Ray as individuals, but more so than anything else, that the story and kind of what it stood for. And something I latched onto early was this concept that Alex ran by me, which was that our understanding of war and stories of this nature have been informed by kind of Hollywood grammar up until now, and that is to say that our understanding of these environments, of these experiences, are informed by what we've seen on screen. And so how do we contribute something different? And so that meant the whole process had to be different, and we couldn't really approach it traditionally or like actors would, and that made our job easier. I think if we'd gone about it in a way where we weren't a team before we were individuals, or if it was a lot of time in the trailers, or if we were being kind of spoken to as actors, or we weren't sort of accountable for ourselves as a unit, I don't think we'd have a much tougher time trying to execute what we executed. And to hark back to what Alex said earlier, it required the crew and the cast to kind of operate as one and all sort of rely on our individual strengths, but really pull together as a unit. And I think the respect that we had both for the story and these two gentlemen meant that like everyone was just willing to push themselves as far as they possibly could, and while constantly remaining aware of the fact that the story and its social impact is going to be far greater than anything else.
Thank you. To ask a little bit more about that social impact, Ray, you said elsewhere that you hope that this film, this kind of approach of filmmaking can act as a bridge for communication for veterans who come back and might struggle to articulate, having been through something like this, what it is that they went through. And that process of readjusting to civilian life is a battle for many veterans, which is why the VA is one of the largest providers of mental health care in the United States. Especially in this moment as the VA is facing 80,000 planned layoffs. It seems so important that civilians understand and sense a certain duty of care towards veterans, towards service people. Can you discuss the importance of giving veterans a voice through storytelling like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of friends, and to include myself, I think you first have to kind of understand what's going on with you, which comes through therapy. I think through understanding, that's how you can learn. Because I didn't have a vocabulary, and I had to really learn. I have a lot of veterans have. There's the veteran and there's the loved one. You have the veteran wanting, or even the active duty military individual wanting to explain something that they either don't understand or don't have the vocabulary to describe it. Then you have the loved one who is desperately wanting to help and wants to be there. So there's a gap there, and that's essentially what this is. And I think in other films, it just depends on what they focused on, and that I wanted to focus on the idiosyncrasies of a gunfight, the confusion, the sounds, the rapid decision making that is required, being afraid and having to make a decision. And that's what courage is, right? It's not just always being a hero, it's moving forward in spite of fear. I think that's, if it could just be like, hey, there's this scene where, Will, which did an excellent job, it's like, it was a fine line. I wanted to make sure that people understood that he was being concussive and not being a coward. And in combat, you can be judged very easily for that. And so there's things like that. I was like, hey, this is like, that's what I experienced when I was either blown up or overwhelmed with violence, your body goes into a fight or flight kind of mode. And so, yeah, if for the better, it could be an example for a voice, and even for, and I wanted to raise questions. If you have a question of like, why were you there, or why didn't you guys do X, Y, and Z? I welcome those questions. I may or may not have an answer, but it should raise questions for a lot of things, whether it's healthcare or why aren't veterans being taken care of, or whatever it is. It should be a conversation piece. It's not so much about, I mean, I think it ends up being kind of organically an anti-war film because of the violence, but there is no political message for it other than I want it to be a conversation piece. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. And to ask about, one aspect of production that this audience just really experienced, this is such a sensory experience, and I know that you shot chronologically going through that process. I'm curious if you can talk about the experience of that, especially in terms of putting this one together with the sound design, with a lot of practical effects, a lot of real explosions. What was that like for all of you to really go through on set and to kind of feel the elevation of as the situation worsens?
Who's that to?
It's all three of you.
Who's first?
Alex, you're first. You're volunteering.
Okay. I always try to shoot in sequence. Obviously, films sometimes can't do that. I always try to do that. What it was like to do that on this film was very intense, very strange. It was a 5-week shoot, which is a short shoot, I would say. Like often films are 10, sometimes a big movie might be 16 weeks or 18 weeks. This was 5, so it's very quick. What that is like when you are shooting in sequence, in addition, shooting in sequence on a film set, which is really constructed to be less like a film set and more like a location. So we had a house you could walk in and around, and a street you could walk up and down, and what you would see out of the window would be the thing you'd see out the window. You walk out the door. It's essentially a location that we've built. Then you take this hour and a half of more or less real time, apart from a coda, or not a coda, a sort of introduction at the beginning, and you elongate it for 5 weeks. That becomes like living the thing in some strange way for 5 weeks. So a sequence that takes half an hour with blood and screaming inside a hallway lasts a week. That's a pretty heavy week. And I would invite everybody in the room to imagine something on Ray's behalf and also on the actor's behalf, which is that while Cosmo Jarvis was lying down with a very convincing prosthetic of brutally mangled legs and sticky fake blood everywhere, Elliot, who he is playing, is 10 feet away watching, while Joe Quinn is lying in the same state. Joe Hildebrand is 10 feet away watching, while DeFaro is doing his scenes. Ray is there watching, while Charles Melton is doing his thing. Some of the guys are blurred out because they're still serving, so we don't say their names or anything. But put yourself in that space, and then add to that the crew. I've never seen a crew with more heartfelt conviction and working so hard to get it right. We all felt we owed it to Ray, we all felt we owed it to Elliot and Joe and all of these guys, and it was an extraordinarily intense, powerful, often very, very moving, I have to say, very moving experience of all of us. All of us three, I saw it, and all the others. I saw that too. I'd see like grips and tears and stuff like that. It was heavy. It was meaningful too.
I can't follow that. No, but there isn't anything else to say. Well said.
And so I would love to open the floor up to some audience questions at this point, if there are any.
I see one right here.
I see one right in front here. There might be microphones.
It's right here.
Oh, sorry, right here. Okay, great. Oh, thank you.
It is on. So my question is, at the beginning of the movie, they enter this house. Why that particular house? Because you liked the way it looked? Did it have strategic significance? Because it sets everything in motion, is that house with the civilians inside.
I did not like the way the house looked. No, it actually wasn't our first choice. Typically, when we go out, not to convey too many tactics here, but we do what we call like a map study. So it's just an overhead imagery, and essentially, what we were doing there is overseeing. There were some Marines that were pushing through that sector, and so our job was to essentially strategically set up so that essentially create a corridor for them to move through. It looked great from the sky, but once we got there on the ground and we looked around our initial house, it didn't provide the avenues that we needed, and so we flexed to another house. And that's all it was. It wasn't, it was just based off of necessity and strategic importance. Yes.
We've got one right over here.
Can you explain why there was like a hyper focus on keeping track of gear, even to the point where it was putting people into tough situations?
Keeping track of what? I'm sorry.
Gear, like the hammer, the weapons.
Yeah, some of those are sensitive items. They have electronics, crypto, things, so, explosives. Guys have grenades on their kit and whatnot. So it's just things we can't just leave there.
Can I add something to that? Because both these questions actually are in a way exactly the kinds of questions that are great to ask. Who asked that family about whether these guys came in? Nobody. You're seeing necessity at play. But that thing about the focus on gear, in the interview we had about that, the guy responsible for that decision said he's haunted by that decision because he did it in a kind of automatic way, but he put everyone, including himself, but the people he pulled out with him, into extreme danger while doing that. So it's a fascinating question. Why do it? Well, because there are layers of events happening. And one of them is a kind of generalized sense of responsibility, a generalized sense of training. We don't leave kit that might contain special things out on the street, but also probably anxiety, adrenaline, confusion. And if he'd stopped to think, he feels later, he would have said, actually, we're not going to do that. So he feels haunted by it, and that's part of the answer. And that's part of the truth of this film. I think that one of the things that Ray and the guys, everybody we talked to, did was speak so honestly. Honestly about mistakes. I have noticed as a civilian the way in which military, but in particular special forces, so in my country that would be the SAS, and here it would be SEALs and Delta Force, are mythologized. They're mythologized by the media and by cinema and by comic books and video games and you name it. They're mythologized by themselves to an extent. And they're young men. They're really very young men who are under enormous stress and enormous pressure. And I think that one of the things that Ray and everyone did was allow us to see past the mythologizing in a way that was another part of the layers of courage and truthfulness that exist on this.
If I can also just add something on behalf of the acting department on that subject, I think that one particular moment in the film where we receive contact, the grenade enters the room, we return fire, and then we're tasked with sort of collapsing to the lower deck of the building. Certain instincts within us as actors kicked in, and it was to do one of two things. It was to panic and play the emotion of the moment, or it was to try and look really slick and really professional, and dare I say it, cool. And those two instincts were informed by pre-existing depictions of these environments, and we had, despite the brilliant training we'd received, we had, on a subconscious level, absorbed the kind of glorification and romanticized sort of representations of war and of the service people who find themselves in that environment. And we all needed a reminder in a very difficult tense, pivotal moment of the movie to return back to our training and not fall prey to that kind of trap. And it was a very interesting kind of moment on the learning curve for us as actors doing this film.
We've got one right over here.
The sound design on this is incredible, and I guess this is more for you, Ray. As a viewer, it was very it's intense. There are sounds that seem otherworldly. Do you feel like that accurately represents the kind of emotions that you're feeling and the sounds that you're hearing? And watching this, do you feel like the sound has been done justice?
Yes, because we did it. So, yeah. No, but I think to your question, like for the ID, it's a very abstract interpretation of that. And it's almost like, how do you through sound interpret what confusion is? Because in reality, I was blacking in and out, right? And so how do you convey that? Other if I were just to do these jump cuts, you would be like, oh, we're jumping through time, but that wasn't this kind of film. And so I had to, we went through. I mean, when you get blown up like that, you don't hear anything. Your hearing goes, and there's a lot of sensory confusion. Your equilibrium's off, so it's very confusing. So I think just like that, I just wanted this very kind of surreal, out of body, just confusion. In regards to some of the other, the bullet impacts, and I think, if you were to watch this again, now what I'm about to tell you is every bullet, whether it's a snap or a thump or a whiz, had a purpose, and that was for the veteran to connect, and that, like we talked before, to say that's what I experienced. So I had to really focus in on that because I didn't want to misrepresent that. So everything was motivated. If you see a gun, Kit Connor was amazing on the machine gun, amazing actor. When you see him shit that gun over, it's for a reason. It's because he's getting shot at. So. The sound design, not only was it what kind of sound, but even how and when I was using each specific sound.
And we've got time for one more. It's the same row right here.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you guys for being here. The movie was really great. Mr. Garland, I'm a big fan of your work. But my question is for Mr. Mendoza. You kind of touched on this a little bit, especially in the previous question, but what was sort of the process for translating a first-person experience into something cinematic and from an outside perspective?
What was the experience, or
What was the process of translating it into something
Sure. Well, a lot of it was these guys, and this will be kind of a long answer, but a lot of these scenes we did were very extensive. They were almost like miniature plays. Even in the rehearsals of that, a lot of times I would leave that to the leadership with Will and Charles. And we would block it out, and they're like, all right, Alex, we'll be back in an hour. And then we'd kind of see what they came up with. And they had they did an amazing job. I can't talk about it enough, how proud I am of them. But essentially we got it down to